Hello and welcome to another edition of History in a Nutshell. This particular history expose will explore three crucial additions to the U.S. Constitution which ensured rights for African Americans following the Civil War. The results of the Civil War put an end to slavery in America once and for all. So what came next for all the African American freedmen who were unsure of their futures? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments all came about during the Reconstruction period, with the intended purposes of mending the atrocities of slavery and fixing the social and political inequities many blacks faced in the U.S. These amendments are important, but, unfortunately, they would not be enough to ensure full rights for African Americans. Throughout the late 19th century and well into the 20th century, much of the progress gained during the Great Experiment of Racial Democracy was undone due to political and racial tensions brought about during Reconstruction. Rights for African Americans, as well as minorities, would not be fully realized until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Join me as we elaborate on the history of the Reconstruction Amendments. Before addressing the Reconstruction Amendments themselves, let's set the stage. The issue with the peculiar institution known as slavery was hotly debated long before the Civil War. Slavery in the New World had been common practice since around the early 17th century. European settlers in North America preferred African slaves over white indentured servants, since in those days, African slaves were viewed as cheaper and more plentiful. Once the North American colonies secured independence from the British monarchy in 1783, the time came for the Founding Fathers to draft a new constitution. During the Constitution's development, several questions arose, such as how would slaves be counted in state populations, and how do we apply the number of slaves to the number of seats a state should proportionately have in the House of Representatives. Founders from the South argued for slavery due to economic reliance and racial prejudice, whereas the Northern founders argued that liberty was more important. Northerners viewed slavery as not only unprofitable, but also linked the oppression of enslaved Africans to their own oppression at the hands of the British. For the sake of keeping the peace between the states, focusing on the ultimate goal of liberty and independence for the newly founded United States, a compromise was reached. The 3/5 compromise agreed that, for the purposes of taxation and representation in the House of Representatives, only 3/5 of a state's slave population would be counted. Yes, many of the Founding Fathers agreed that slavery was a violation of the spirit of liberty so essential during the American Revolution. However, due to their commitment to private property rights, limited government, and harmony, the Founding Fathers were unwilling to address the issue of slavery. Slavery in the South experienced a wane after the Revolution, but this wane would be short-lived, for once Eli Whitney invented his famous cotton gin in 1793, the South's economy skyrocketed in profit. Whitney's gin made the processing of cotton much easier, and when the North's demand for cotton increased, so too did the South's need for laborers. Even though the U.S. Congress abolished the international slave trade in 1808, the domestic slave trade maintained a steady business. By the year 1860, the number of slaves in the U.S. had reached around 4 million. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Americans were split between the economic benefits of slavery and the constitutional and moral questions slavery raised. The work many blacks performed in the South was both brutal and backbreaking. Many blacks were oppressed and treated harshly. However, many in the North were not fully aware of the poor social conditions faced by blacks in the South. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin opened the eyes of many in the North, debunking the myths that blacks were happy working in the South. As more news of the South's harsh treatment of slaves made its way north, this, in turn, only fueled the flames for the abolitionist movement. Three critical legal decisions made in the early 1800s would set America on the path to civil war. As America expanded westward, the question arose of whether or not slavery would also spread to new territories. The first of these legal decisions was the Missouri Compromise in 1820. To maintain the balance between free states and slave states, Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine remained free. The Missouri Compromise also ruled that slavery would not be allowed in the Louisiana Territory north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude line. In 1854, the Missouri Compromise would be repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which decided that, under popular sovereignty, settlers in new states would decide for themselves if their state was free or slave. This led to the bloody crisis known as Bleeding Kansas, where anti-slavery and pro-slavery settlers fought each other over the decision. 3 years later, in 1857, with the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that all blacks, free or slave, lacked the rights of citizenship and could not sue in federal court. The Supreme Court then took a few steps further. It ruled that Congress overstepped its bounds with the earlier Missouri Compromise, stating that Congress did not have the authority to forbid or abolish slavery in U.S. territories. Popular sovereignty was also ruled unconstitutional. This meant that slaves had no legal means of protesting their treatment. Tensions between North and South reached a boiling point in the years 1859 and 1860. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 caused the deaths of 10 people, and Brown himself was hanged for his crimes. Brown's insurrection revealed that there was no hiding from the question of slavery any longer. In the North, John Brown was hailed as a martyr, while in the South, he was vilified as a mass murderer. Southerners viewed the opposition to slavery as an attack on their livelihoods and their rights. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 would be the straw which broke the camel's back, so to speak. Now, contrary to popular belief, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the traditional sense. In a debate in Charleston, Illinois, in 1858, Lincoln himself admitted, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." However, Lincoln did believe that the institution of slavery was morally reprehensible, and that blacks had the right to improve their conditions in society and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Lincoln himself had no plan for addressing slavery. However, the Republican platform on which he ran was very clear about stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. The South feared that the Republican Party would eventually abolish slavery outright. 11 states seceded from the Union, and from April 1861 to April 1865, the fates of African Americans would be decided in the Civil War.